Now that I've got you standing, I'm going to invite you to open your Bibles with me to the book of Ruth. We're going to be in chapter 2. If you weren't with us last week, again, I'm going to really invite you to go back and catch up with us. Last week's sermon is already posted. Because it's a story, it kind of builds on itself. So we're going to ask you, if you haven't heard that, to go back there. I think that would be helpful for the remainder. Ruth chapter 2, we're going to read verses 1 through 23. If you were given a gift Bible on your way in, that's going to be on starting on page 143 of that gift Bible. The book of Ruth, chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech. His name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. And he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers." So she came, and she continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." And she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Then she said, "I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants." And at mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine." So she ate beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." So she gleaned in the field until evening, and then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, "The man's name with whom I work today is Boaz." And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." And Ruth the Moabite said, "Besides, he said to me, 'You shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest.'" And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted." So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests, and she lived with her mother-in-law. This is the word of the Lord. Let's pray. Father, the story unfolds, and it's a familiar story, not just because we've read it before. It's a familiar story because it's It's our story. And more than that, it's your story. Give us eyes to see, ears to hear, hearts to respond to the truth of this story. A love story for sure. The story of the greatest love of all. Of a God who through the least likely brought about the most glorious. Let us take hope. Let us take courage. Let us take correction. Let us take admonition from this. And let us leave here, Lord, the greater trust, a lively hope, and a message of a loving, sovereign God to share with those all around us. This is our prayer. For your name's sake, amen. You can be seated. Thank you. That's some pretty serious reading. Congratulations. Welcome to our second installment in the book of Ruth, which is, as we've been noticing, a veritable portrait of God's providence at work and working in the life of some really, really ordinary people, bringing to pass His really extraordinary purposes. And I hope that we've been able to identify with some of the characters in the story to the degree that we can see our own stories, as I mentioned, that we can individually and even collectively see that our lives are no less a portrait of God's providence at work. I pray that we can see that soon. I pray that this is not just something that we can come to appreciate on our deathbeds or in the final stretch of our race, but that we can already, if you've lived for even a couple of years in the knowledge of God, that you can look back and see a God who has been intimately, intricately at work in your life for His glory and your good. As a matter of fact, my prayer is that we go from seeing God's providence in our lives to seeing our lives in God's providence. To seeing how my life and your life and our life together is a part of this larger thing that God is doing called redemption and the restoration of all things. Last week, in looking only at the first chapter, and again, I recommend you go back and you study the chapter for sure, and that you, if you can, make time and listen to the message. We saw the coexistence of very real decisions made by individual people, the human choices that they made, and their very real consequences. And we saw that working hand in hand with the sovereignty of God. And God moving things and making things happen. And from this privileged perch that we have as New Testament believers, we see God's overarching and overruling plan of redemption building and moving forward to, and we cheated last week. Remember, we cheated. We went right to the end of the book and we looked at the last verses and we saw how all of this is just moving forward, unstoppable. He just cannot be thwarted. God's plan moving forward to bring about redemption in Jesus Christ. But it's just amazing to see how the pieces go together and how God got to that place through a simple, gritty, salt of the earth kind of story like the story of Ruth. But it's God. We witness God's sovereignty and man's responsibility together. It's not unique to this story. Again, it's our story. But again, most of all, it's God's story. So by the time we finished our study in chapter 1 last week, we've gotten so far as to see a family during a really dark span of the history of Israel. Remember, we saw that it was the time of the judges. There was no king, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Set aside, this nation had set aside the promises and the commands of God. And this particular family had so set aside the promises of God that were so tied to the land that they went off and they went to go live in the culture that God so abominated and warned them against. They went to Moab, famously wretched nation. Somehow we marveled at, and yet found something familiar in. The way Elimelech somehow reasoned through this and justified that, I know God says that's not good, but when push comes to shove, we can set faith on the shelf and act in pragmatism and human wisdom. And so he made a choice for his family, and high prices were paid. Elimelech thought that they'd just be in Moab for a moment, as we often do when we take forays into sin. We think we'll just visit. He ended up staying. He ended up dying. He ended up buried there. He's still in Moab. And he thought he would just go for a while. Forays into rebellion are too often ending that way. And while he was there, you remember that he took Moabite wives for his 2 sons, something again that God had warned against. Don't do this. But they did. And after a decade or so of living outside of God's expressed commands, his 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, followed Elimelech to the grave. And they stayed in Moab too. It's a sad story thus far. 2 sons now die, leaving their widowed mother, Naomi, in a pagan land with nothing but a thrice broken heart, and 2 pagan, Gentile, widowed daughters-in-law. What a trio. And by the time the curtain falls on chapter 1, even one of those daughters-in-law, Orpah, goes back to her people, back to her gods. And now Naomi and a very determined Ruth are making their way back to Bethlehem. But it's not before Ruth squashes Naomi's efforts to send her back to her people and her gods, the gods of Moab. She tells you, go, there's nothing good. I mean, clearly I'm not good luck. I mean, look at me and going with me back to my people. I mean, they're really nothing to write home about either, and they're not going to welcome you too well, and your best hopes are to stay. And that's when Ruth just squashes all of her efforts with those words that are so well known and so often quoted, and I just don't mind reading them again. And Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go. And where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. And we do well to marvel and to praise here again over the fact that Ruth, and I'm going to beat this drum a little bit because I know so many times we preclude ourselves from the promises of God because we feel that we are so exceptionally handicapped in some way or another. Yes, that's all true, and I could say amen for everybody else, but my circumstances are so unique that doesn't apply to me. I mean, the deck is just so stacked against me. The probabilities, the statistical possibility of me being able to be blessed in any kind of a way, used in any kind of a way in God's, it's just so against me that I can say amen for everyone else, but this really can't apply to me. Well, tell me if your situation is worse than Ruth's. Ruth is poor. I don't mean she doesn't have the latest Nikes. I mean destitute. Hand to mouth. Maybe some of you have been there for a day, maybe 2. But this is her reality. Ruth is not just poor. Ruth is now a migrant, with all that comes with that. Ruth is also pagan. In the eyes of the Israelites, brand new in her faith in this Jehovah, still fumbling and stumbling in the ways of God. She's a Gentile, outside of the commonwealth of Israel and all the blessings that come with that. That's not hers by blood. And a widow. No protection, no provision in a patriarchal society. Your situation if it's worse than Ruth's, come see me. I've never met a person with more stacked against them. And despite the horrible unfaithfulness that was exemplified, remember, she's living amongst Israelites who are outside of God's land, outside of God's commandments, living in ways that totally flout the law of God and His provision for them, outside of their land, taking wives. That she looks at them and says, you're exactly what your God says we are not to be. And somehow, in the midst of all that horrible testimony, horrible example, horrible lives lived in front of her by people who were said to be the people of God, somehow God, in His sovereign, glorious goodness, grants Ruth faith, lays hold of her and she to him and says, that's the God I want to serve. I know you haven't served Him well, Naomi, but that God trumps every other God, Chemosh and every other God of the Moabites. I know my husband should have never even gotten involved with me, should have never been unequally yoked with me, but nonetheless, through the midst of it all and all of the mixed messages, God laid hold of me and He will be my God. All in God's providence. Recall, providence, it's that biblical doctrine that points to the truth that God is deeply involved with His creation, bringing about His predetermined ends. God at work among us. But as the Puritan John Flavel used to say, providence is like Hebrew words. You really only understand them when you read them backwards. For those of you who don't know, you read Hebrew from right to left. And he's saying that's kind of like the way we see providence best. It's not when we look forward. It's when we look back. And we say, oh, look what the Lord did. I didn't get it at the moment. I fussed and cussed and worried and stressed out and lost hair. And now I look back and I see God working. I'm so glad that God did what He did the way He did. And we should often look back over our shoulders, acknowledging and praising God's good and wise works, even in those temporarily painful chapters. And some of you have had some hard chapters. And we would so soon want to just close those chapters and never again look at those chapters. But we would do well knowing that our God is provident and good and wise beyond anything we would do well to open those chapters again and look. And you might have to look hard and long, but see God at work there. In this life, we should garner a trust in God that says, as David did, even for those hard times, as David did in Psalm 119, it is good for me that I was afflicted, that I might learn your statutes. If at the end the net result was I went through unadulterated hell on earth, but I came out knowing God better, well worth it. Well worth every tear and every sleepless night. Well worth it if at the end we came to know and trust God better. The cancer was worth it. Waiting for the results was worth it. Sometimes through deep loss that has not been restored, still, at the end of it, if I've come to know and trust God, if it's caused me to be disentangled from the things of this earth, if it's caused me to drop lesser things for the greater things, well worth it. It was good for me that I was afflicted. May we have the enduring hope based on God's sure promises that moved Paul to write in Romans 8:18, for I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. He doesn't deny, he doesn't say the Christian way of life is to deny your suffering. Oh no, it's not there. I don't receive that. Oh no, you hear people naming and claiming and rejecting and oh, I void that. I send it back. No, you don't. You suffer it. But you suffer it unto the glory of God, knowing that when it's all said and done, He has promised that the intimacy, the closeness, the knowledge of God will be greater. And the Apostle Paul, for all his learning, said, I count everything I've ever had and known as dung, for the excellency of the knowledge of Jesus Christ outweighs everything else. And if we have to go through the valley of the shadow of death to have a better working knowledge of who God is, then go to the valley and know He is with you. And so Paul was able to say, for this light momentary affliction, and it's just ridiculous to me. I'm ridiculous. When I count myself in suffering and I hear Paul in the suffering that he endured, calling it light and momentary. Light and momentary. How can you call it light and momentary? Because he's thinking of something weightier and more eternal. It's light because compared to the weight of glory that awaits me, it's nothing. It's momentary because this life is short and eternity's long, and he never lost sight of that. So he could say, for this light momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory. There's the answer to the light affliction. We have a weight of glory beyond all comparison as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. There's his answer to the temporal nature of our suffering. No matter what it is you're going through in this life, it too will pass. It might pass tomorrow. It might pass when the EKG reads flat, but it will pass. And eternity will go on and on and on. That being said, there are those moments, even very, very long seasons sometimes of this life, that we can't get behind us. We can't look back at them because we're still in them. And they're not going to make sense this side of heaven. In a new heaven and a new earth, and in the age to come, once past the pain and once past the struggle and the bitter tasting providences of this life, it will make sense. Or when we get there, when it's all done, when it's all made right, we may not get an explanation. But all that we went through may just dissolve in its insignificance in comparison to the glory of Jesus Christ, into whose eyes we are looking. What I'm saying is, I don't plan on showing up to heaven demanding explanations. No, once we're there, we will not complain about the path that led us there. For God in His good providence is at work. But at this point in this story, Ruth and Naomi they're still very much on earth. They're not in glory. It's not all done yet. Their struggle is not over. Providence is not clear, and the workings of God are still mysterious. What are you doing, God? No detailed explanations or timetables are given for their pain, as is the case for perhaps more than a few of us here today. Just wondering, when's it going to end? How long can this struggle go on? Well, chapter 1 ended on that hopeful note that the barley harvest was underway in Bethlehem. You remember that? Chapter 2 opens with a really strangely timed bit of information that the author brilliantly puts in front of us to build an anticipation, to highlight God's sure mercies in an apparently uncertain circumstance for these two widows. Chapter 2 opens with these seemingly random words. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. What does that have to do with anything? And why does the author throw it in there? So what? Well, now again, we've cheated. We read this story. We went to the end. We see Boaz's name throughout, and we see it at the end as him being this progenitor, him being this forefather of the Christ who was to come. But at this point, nobody knew that. Especially for the original readers who'd not cheated as we did and rushed ahead and read the last few verses. This really cranks up the anticipation in the story here. The original readers would have known that a widow who somehow has a relative on her husband's side who's called worthy. Now, that word doesn't quite encapsulate what the Hebrew word is there, but this man is called a worthy man, and he's related to her husband. That in such a dark day and the circumstances that these ladies are living in, that is just a ray of hope that pierces through the dark clouds. All of a sudden, they're wondering what's going to happen next. See, because there were once laws and customs that would call upon the surviving relatives of a deceased man. It would call upon them to care for those who survived him, even raise up children in his name, because again, God didn't want any line of his people to go extinct. And so if a man died and he had no children, his brother was under an obligation to take that man, his brother's wife, and bear children to his name with her. And here we hear that there's someone on the husband's side who's not just alive, but worthy. Again, this is the time of the judges, though. Let's not forget the context, the milieu that they're living in. These are dark, dark days. It says, there was no king, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. That's what Bethlehem looked like. So even if there was this man that really, was he going to follow God's word? Nobody else was. Was he going to hold to God's law when everybody else had set it aside? Really? I mean, if he were to just throw that law out and reject Ruth and Naomi and his responsibilities, who in that society was going to call him on the carpet for that? You could get away with murder, literally dismembering kind of violent murder in the days of the judges, if you've ever read it. So neglecting a widow would have been no big deal. And here's Naomi coming back after she's abandoned God's people, gone off for greener pastures. She's not going to be received very well, potentially. And Ruth again is a Moabite, an unwelcomed immigrant. She shows up as a constant reminder of her family's past sins. But again, we've been served notice from the very first verse of this chapter that there remains a relative who is a worthy man. This word worthy in Hebrew speaks of character and strength, even wealth, valor, uprightness, might. This is a stand-up guy. And it sets the reader's mind racing, I think I know somebody who could use a man like that right now. But here's the thing, see, neither Naomi nor Ruth had read verse 1. They're just hungry. That's it. They're just hungry. They're not putting together the pieces of providence and looking at redemptive history and seeing. They're just trying to not die. And Ruth was not going to sit back and starve and watch her mother-in-law dwindle before her. So with this new fire that she has and this sense that life was not over, and she's traded everything, her gods, for the one true God, and there is a spunk in this girl that stands out. And verse 2 says, and Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the field and among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor. Notice the expectation in that. I'm going to go pick up some food in the field of the guy who will be kind to me. In an unkind nation who particularly didn't like her, she's got a confidence about her. So she said to her, go, my daughter. So she set out and went and gleaned in the field. She didn't say, I'm going to go see if I find food. She says, I'm going to go and I'm going to glean. And then something interesting happens here. And the author begins to play a game with us. Verse 3. So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. Go figure. And he said, and behold, verse 4, Boaz came from Bethlehem. Right place, right time. And he said to the reapers, the Lord be with you. And they answered, the Lord bless you. So we hear the faith of Ruth and her decision to go to the fields. Not wondering if, but where she's going to find favor. See, apparently Ruth had heard something of this kind of a welfare to work program that God had instituted amongst his people. A law which Jehovah had given to them. We find it in Leviticus 19 and again in Deuteronomy 24, whereby poor, immigrant, fatherless, and the widow could go into a field at harvest time and work behind the reapers, those who were picking the produce. They could go behind them and they could pick up anything that was missed, advertently or inadvertently. That is, the law said, number one, you don't harvest all the way to the edges and all the way to the corners of your field. You leave a little bit of a margin so that the hungry and the sojourner and the fatherless and the widow can go and they can eat from those meager rations. Furthermore, as you're going and you're picking, if you drop something, you're not allowed to double back and get it. That's theirs now. This was God's mercy, God building amongst his people a kind of covenant mercy, a kind of chesed, a kind of loving kindness that says, hey, listen, this is the kind of people we are because this is the kind of God I am. And you're to reflect me in acts of justice and mercy and taking into account those who do not have at the moment. This is not just their test, it's your test. And so there they are. And Ruth's hoping that someone remembers this law. Her life depends on someone remembering this law. And this was for, again, the migrant, the poor, the widow, the fatherless. And Ruth could tick most of those boxes. The harvesters were ordered not to take it all. But since all the other laws were being flouted in those days, what was going to happen to Ruth? And Ruth was wondering if she could find what she called favor on this day. She couldn't yet see. In her new faith, and with the less than stellar teaching that Elimelech and Naomi had given her, she wasn't able to see God's providential workings in her life, and she's wondering if there is favor to be had. She doesn't yet know. She can't yet see what we see from where we are. But God's favor had been providentially placed upon her before the foundations of the world. And hers, though it looked bad and dark and scarcity was upon her, hers is a privileged position amongst all of God's creatures. She falls into a rare bloodline. And here on this day, it's only going to begin to become just a little bit more clear to her that God is a God of providence. And when the favor that was about to unfold before her came, it was still just a foretaste of the kindness and the covenant mercies for sinners that would come through her offspring. The child that would be born ultimately from this chance meeting. Now, if it bothers you to hear me talk about a chance meeting, it bothers me to say it. Because we don't talk about things that way. We are nothing if not insistent upon the fact that things come to pass the way God or sovereignly ordains them to happen. We don't believe in chance and luck and such things. As the late Dr. Sproul used to say, there is not one maverick molecule in the universe. God directing it all. But I use the word chance here as a tip of the hat to the author who kind of tongue-in-cheek here uses essentially the same term when he talks about Ruth and how she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. He's playing with us. He already told us who Boaz was. He's about to tell us what God does through this relationship. But in the moment, he says, it just seemed like happenstance. A more literal translation of that happened to come to the part of the field where the field belonging to Boaz. A more literal translation would be, in our more modern terms, as luck would have it, or coincidentally, or simply by chance, she came to this field owned by this man. After he's abruptly told us that this worthy relative, Boaz, exists, he proceeds to tell us in verse 2, oh yeah, and she stumbled upon his field. And then in verse 4, he goes on to say, and behold, Boaz showed up. That word behold, it means see, don't miss, or as it were, check it out. She happens to end up at the right field, and then dude shows up. Imagine. What a turn of luck. In a story that is a portrait of God's providence, all of these apparent coincidences here, they're just too much. They're too much to attribute to just dumb luck. The author here is using irony, and he's pointing us to the fact that in Ruth's eyes, at this moment, that's all it seemed like. I'm looking for favor. I'm looking for a field owned by the kind of man who would keep the laws of God. And I want to come upon this field and be received by the workers, the other gleaners. And I want to make sure that there's even something for me to glean. This is what I need. And it's going to have to be favor. And it's exactly what she finds. And she is taken by the stroke of luck that she thinks she's having. But we must see in Ruth's story what we must see in our own stories. Chapter 1 was so hard. 3 funerals, 10 years of trying to have a baby and not being able to. They'd seen famine. Now they're refugees. Chapter 1 was hard. Chapter 2 comes out sunshine. But here's what Ruth has to see, and here's what we have to see. God didn't show up in chapter 2. God was just as glorious and just as involved and just as loving in chapter 1, the dark chapter, the hard chapter, as he was in chapter 2. You might be in chapter 1 right now. And you can't help but pray for a chapter 2 and 3 and 4. I just want to be done with chapter 1 because I want to be near you and I want to feel your love and I want to feel your blessings. He is here in chapter 1. He's no less God in chapter 1 than he is in chapter 2. Then to accentuate the worthiness of this Boaz fella, and the dawning of better days for Ruth, we get this kind of strange glimpse into the everyday life of Boaz. Another day at the office. He shows up at his field and he meets his workers. And notice how he greets them. He greets them. He, the landowner, he, the aristocratic, wealthy man of enterprise, shows up and greets the lowly, manual, menial laborers. He greets them with nothing less than blessing. The Lord be with you. Now, again, this is not customary. It wasn't like the way we say God bless you when someone sneezes, with no thought of God at all. He sees them and he makes known to them his greatest desire for them, and it comes out the moment he sees them. The Lord be with you. Jehovah in all his glorious presence be among you. And they answered him, the Lord bless you. Anybody want to work there? Some of us have worked for some jerks, man. Some of us have had some jerks work for us. Some of us have been the jerk. But what a work atmosphere, huh? The exchange of blessings. The desire for God's presence, even in the field. But it gives us an idea of who this man is, that he could hold such relationships. Not because it was customary, not because all the other landowners were doing it that way. They were cruel taskmasters. But here is a man different, a man worthy. Boaz did not leave his faith at the temple on the Sabbath. In that kind of compartmentalized life that we want to live, I have a separate vocabulary for Sunday morning, and it looks nothing like the syntax I referred to on Friday at work. But not Boaz. Boaz is a worthy man in all circumstance. It's not the Sabbath, or they wouldn't be working, and yet his thoughts are of God. Oh, that we could have a Sunday kind of a devotion, a Sunday kind of a song, a Sunday kind of vocabulary all week and in every circumstance. No matter what the culture accepted around him, Boaz was a worthy man. And being a vigilant and observant businessman, he notices the new girl, and so he asks the foreman of the reapers about her, and he receives a report. Probably would have moved a lesser man, definitely would have moved a lesser man to abuse and to be predatory here. He says, oh yeah, that's a widow, daughter-in-law of a widow. She's like poor times two. She has no man to protect her, to defend her honor. She is a pigeon. And it doesn't move Boaz to be a predator like so many of the other men. Ruth is powerless. She's seemingly unprotected. She's of a disdained nationality. And it's all added up to make her the perfect victim. That's not at all what he had in mind. In verse 9, specific orders had been given to the male workers not to touch her. He makes it a point. And then in verse 22, when she finally gets home, as we read, Naomi expresses relief because Ruth had not been assaulted. And she says, don't go to another field because you run the risk of being assaulted, because that's what normally happened to women out in the field in those days. And not just those days, but these days. Ruth was living in circumstances not unlike those of so many of those working in the fields around us right now as we speak. Set your politics aside. The reality is there are women being abused in every dark and possible way in our town, in our fields, in buses and in motels all around our town. And most of it goes unreported. And these women are far from home, trying to put money together to take care of those who need the money. And they are being abused because they were like Ruth. Unprotected, alone, destitute. And for those of us small groups who are looking for some kind of a subset of our culture to minister to, those being victimized, yes, there are the children, yes, there are the elderly, yes, but there are also those who are living just like Ruth right now in fear, in constant abuse in our town, in our fields. Could be blessed by a worthy man, a worthy woman, a worthy church, a worthy small group to step up and not act like it's not happening. But just as we mentioned, and just as the author prepared us for, Boaz here, he begins to shine in all of his godly worthiness. In the verses that follow here, Boaz provides for all of Ruth's needs, and he shows her favor beyond all that she ever dreamt of that morning when she left Naomi's house. If they had a house. Boaz shines in the protection that he gives to Ruth. He tells Ruth not to wander from the field like gleaners did. They would just bounce around. It really was tantamount to collecting aluminum cans. And you just kind of go where the getting's good. And he says, go nowhere else. There is not safety there like there is safety here. He warns his own men who seem to be good men, who exchange blessings with him. He still warns them. He says, hey, you with whom I exchange blessings every morning when I arrive, don't you touch her. I want to make sure and clear that she is to be protected. Boaz shines in not just his careful protection of her, but in his lavish provision for her. He tells her, oh, you know what? In the heat of the day and in the hard work, you're going to get thirsty, and I don't want you on top of everything else to have to go to the well and draw from there. We have water set aside for the paid workers. You can go ahead and drink from there. He tells her furthermore, and in the first place, yes, you can glean in my field. And what he's saying is, I know the law, and it matters to me. And I know the God behind the law. And he goes on to display in just a moment, he's not just familiar with the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law. And he doesn't just provide to her what the law demands, but he goes and reflects the very heart of God, and he shows her kindness far beyond that. Now remember, this is after years of failed crops, and it's lawless and kingless, and he could have gotten away with anything, but he knows he is not kingless. No matter what the culture around us says is socially acceptable, he knows that he answers to a much higher standard, and he is a reflection of that God in an unscrupulous country. You know, as you go back and you read those passages in Leviticus 19, Deuteronomy 24 that talk about the law of harvesting and how they weren't to go to the edges but leave something for the poor, you know what it doesn't say? It doesn't say how close to the edge you can go. It doesn't say how much of the corners you should leave. It doesn't say. It just says leave something. The letter of the law commands that something be left for the poor. But God leaves room for interpretation so that the landowner, so that every landowner, so that any of us who has any kind of assets can go beyond the robotic religious obedience and practice heartfelt generosity, which is the spirit of the law, a reflection of the heart of a loving God. And so it is with our giving of our time, our treasure, our talents, our care for others, our support for gospel work. That's why you don't hear us focused on percentages and minimums. It's not the heart of giving. There is room for interpretation so that we have the opportunity to be generous, so that we're not just doing the minimum requirement, but so that we know that in God's economy, there is a place for me to reflect thanks to Him and love to others by generosity. And that's why Boaz is called a worthy man. You're not looking for how little do I have to give. He says, how much can I give her? He goes way beyond the law, and he invites her. So he's got his employees. Remember, these people, these are working capital. These people generate profits for him, so it behooves him to keep them fed. Gleaners only take, do not contribute. And yet he says to her, Ruth, don't eat over there. Come and sit with the employees. Well, I might sit with the employees, but I didn't bring a lunch. I got your lunch too, girl. I'm looking for ways. I'm creatively looking for ways to bless you. Does that sound familiar? Do you know someone in your life? Are you aware of, are you conscious of, are you sensitive to the fact that there is someone in your life that is creative and seizing every opportunity, in fact, in His majesty, creating opportunity for Himself to lavishly bless you in ways that you didn't even ask for? Redeemers are like that. Boaz isn't finished. He goes from generosity to just lavishness. So he tells Ruth, hey, and furthermore, since we're on it here, when you get back out in the field, I don't want to see you lingering back with the gleaners waiting for scraps. I want you right up shoulder to shoulder with those who are harvesting. And then he goes to those who are harvesting and says, and by the way, drop good stuff for her. Where is this coming out of? His bottom line. But he presses forward, looking for ways to bless her in sacrificial kindness that resonates with the heart of God. Fast forward, end of the story, or ending of the story. Ruth finishes up her day of gleaning. She left the house, hoping for favor in field somewhere by someone. All of a sudden, God rains down on her all of this favor that exceeds exceedingly abundantly above all that she could ask or think. And she finds herself now heavy laden with an ephah of grain that she had beaten out and the leftovers from this massive lunch that he gives her, this doggy bag. She left the house with a grumbling stomach. She comes back with a sore back, not from the gleaning, but from the grain that she carries. An ephah was the equivalent of 15 to 20 times the wage of a hired person. She came home with enough for her and Naomi to live for 2 weeks on, one day of gleaning. But that didn't happen before she took the time to acknowledge the kindness shown her. Having found lavish protection and provision in Boaz, Ruth is now moved to a sincere and a humble gratitude. Verse 10, then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me since I am a foreigner? She says, I am fully aware of how inordinate this kindness is. I am not of the type of person that says, well, you better give me something. She was not of that welfare mentality that says, I have an entitlement to this. No, she says, who am I? Again, in verse 13, she said, I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants. Boaz sees the work the Holy Spirit has done in Ruth's heart. And he teaches her to attribute all her blessings now to the Lord and not to him. To the Lord for whom she had abandoned all of her other gods. He says, you know, when you did that, you came into a relationship with a God so loving and so kind. I want you to know your blessings aren't luck. Your blessings have everything to do with that commitment that you made to that God. And Boaz answered her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother in your native land and came to the people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and fully reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Understand this and get used to it, Ruth. This is life. You now live under the shadow of his wings. Everything that happens to you will happen under the purview of the God of glory. It will happen in the hollow of his hand. You are part of his great plan and the object of his great love. Get used to it, Ruth. We ought to get used to it. You see, still a redeemer even more worthy than Boaz is doing the same thing. Boaz is saying, look to the Father. Look to the Father. And Jesus comes to us, our great Redeemer, saying, look to the Father. Behold, what love He's shown us. Behold, He sent His Son to you so that you might be reconciled to Him. Just like Boaz, better than Boaz is Jesus. Worthy Boaz is surpassed by the worthiness of Jesus. And still, to this day, those who, like Ruth, are broken and lonely and strangers to the goodness of God, they find themselves laden with the kindness and the mercies of God in Christ. Only to look back and see it was His providence all along. I've met so many Christians who hold a certain bitterness, an offense against God for the chapter 1s in their life. I'm good, I'll serve you, I'll keep going to church, but I'm never going to forget 1984. I'm never going to forget what happened back in those years, in that marriage, in that hospital. I'm not going to forget that. I'll still serve you. But you hold an offense because you, as of yet, are unable to look back into chapter 1 and see a God at work, loosening your grip on lesser things that you might lay hold of things eternal, changing your values and shaking the tree of our life that only that which is true and right will stay. And that night, at the end of what first appeared to be a very lucky day, Ruth gets home. Naomi is blown away. And as it was last week, at the end of chapter 1, the author closes the chapter. He closes chapter 2 now, hinting toward events to come. Verse 23. So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests. This is like a regular gig now. This is her place. She went out for a day of scrounging, and now she has a place to be all through the barley harvest, all through the wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. Ruth had found a regular place of provision and protection with Boaz. He was not a redeemer to be simply visited. She was to live under his care. Some things never change. And the last line of the chapter points to Ruth's faithfulness to her commitment not to leave Naomi. She was still a gleaner. And the truth is that even the wheat harvest was going to end soon. And then what? If she was to dine at his table and be lavished with his protection and provision, this living arrangement would have to change at some point. But as of now, in all faithfulness, she still lives with her mother-in-law. What will happen next? Providence would soon reveal. But this is not the story of Elimelech. It's not the story of Orpah or Naomi or Ruth. This is the story of the true and better Boaz. It's the story of a greater act of mercy, a more lavish display of love. As it was for Ruth, so it has been for you and me. Of all of the apparently lucky and unlucky chapters in life, we know now that they have served, as we saw last week, to providentially empty us of everything that is not Him, that we would have a greater fullness in Him. Meet your Redeemer and never depart from His love and care. Jesus. Jesus died in the place of sinners. Jesus rose for our resurrection and eternal life, justifying us in victory. Jesus still rescues the broken, the needy, destitute. You might have money in your pocket. We know there's a lot of different kinds of bankruptcy. There's a lot of different kinds of scarcity and leanness that comes upon our heart, and he still rescues. Jesus, if anyone ever deserved the title to be called worthy, he's worthy. He's worthy of our worship. He's worthy of our devotion. He's worthy of every moment of this life and the next. Know him. Young person, know him. Old person, know him. Know him and the true favor that God has providentially ordained for you. Turn, trust him today in hardship, in abundance, no matter what the season of life. He wants to empty us too of lesser things for a greater fullness, that we might know and find true favor and long for the scraps of this earth no more. Pray with me.